This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Please like the video and subscribe to my channel. I need all the help I can get with the algorithm. But I did want to talk a little bit more today about Jupiter entering Taurus. There are so many facets of this transit, it's really ridiculous. But let's get into it because this is important. This is important for current events. And it's important for your livelihood. Let's talk about this really quick because Jupiter in Taurus often brings prosperity. It brings abundance. We'll see, we'll see inflation. We'll see stock prices increase. We'll see things get overvalued, right? I mean, we can already see this when it comes to commodities markets. Now, inflation has been going down just a little bit, but people are still feeling the hurt. So, but like I said, Jupiter rules the first house of the United States, the Sibley chart, which we have right up here. The inner wheel is the United States, and the outer wheel are the current transits. So you can see right here, we have Sagittarius rising, and this is all based on, the classic July 4th, 1976, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we put it at 5 p.m. here. We won't get into why right now. Just suffice it to say that's what we do. So anyway, so Jupiter rules Sagittarius, the first house. So why is this interesting? Well, like I said, we'll see periods of prosperity associated with this transit. In this case, Jupiter is leaving the fifth house here, Aries, right? Which is all about what? Taking risks, gambling, enjoyment, and entering now the sixth house. You can see him right here. And the sixth house in this case, we think of as responsibility and consistency and potentially the enemies that we could see here. Oppositions. And we can already see this when it comes to, right, the debt ceiling and things like that, which is a big point of contention here, really quick. So Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has already said in her usual monotone, very underwhelming voice that we are headed for some very dire situations. But let me tell you what I see here and what I think, because this is sort of interesting. Now, Jupiter is leaving, like I said, the U.S.'s fifth house for the sixth house of responsibility. But in May 2024, Jupiter will leave Taurus in the sixth house and enter Gemini and the United States' seventh house, you see, of partnerships and opponents, right? Rivals, rivalries. The sixth house is more like enemies, people we're engaged in conflict with. Whereas it's just an opposition. It could be a partnership or it could be a sports opponent, someone we're directly facing in the seventh house. But the sixth traditionally was enemies, injuries, illnesses, as well as pets and small animals. So Jupiter is in exile or detriment in Gemini because he rules the opposite sign Sagittarius. So when he ingresses into Gemini, we often see an economic downturn following the prosperity, right? Sometimes we see rising unemployment, rising interest rates, rising inflation, and sometimes recessions. So we'll dig into some examples here right now because I think this is important for our future coming up. So now in 1928, we're starting here in 1928. And it's interesting to note that between 1928 and 2012, every time Jupiter has been in Taurus, we've had a presidential primary. Right? It's been when the Democratic and Republican conventions are typically being held and they decide on their nominee for the presidential election. Just an interesting side note. So in 1928, we had some prosperous times. You might recognize that date, 1928, as sort of preceding 1929, which is a very famous date in US economic history, right? Well, unemployment was very low, 1.6%. You know, we usually allot for a 5% unemployment. We had high profit yields, inflated stock prices. When it came to railroads, commodities, farmers were raking in record profits for their crops. We also had people buying stocks on a margin, which is essentially like credit. So you could put up, you know, a sliver of collateral, get the rest on loan, and buy a bunch of stocks. You can see where that could potentially go wrong, right? Well, then we had 1929 to 1930 when Jupiter went into Gemini. And guess what? Jupiter was in Gemini when the stock market crash happened. There was a big stock market crash in October of 1929. After that, while Jupiter was still in Gemini, the unemployment rate sharply rose in 1930, more than doubling from 1929, where it was something like 3.8%. And then in 1933, it finally reached 25%, you know, gosh, a quarter of the population. So that's a really, I mean, that's a very difficult example, sort of a very dire example, and an extreme example of what we're talking about. We'll see some more minor ones, but I'm still concerned. 1929 to 1930, we just talked about. So 1940, when 1940 was during, of course, World War II. It was before the US joined, of course. But during that time when Jupiter went into Gemini, the inflation rates sharply rose from 3.8% to 5%. So, and unemployment, it actually decreased at that time, probably because of the war effort. We had to put lots of people back to work to mobilize the country. So, but in 1952, not soon after, notice these are in 12-year increments. Why is that? Because it takes Jupiter approximately 12 years to round the zodiac. So we had an explosion in 1952 of population. It was the baby boom, the height of the baby boom. In fact, it followed the war, World War II. Nearly 45 million families by 1952 were spending several $100 billion, not a piece, but collectively. 2/3 of which went to the retail sector. So we saw the boom, right, in consumer economics, right, in consumption. That's what drove our economy from then on, right? New products, consumer goods. Very Taurus. But then 1953, when Jupiter went into Gemini, we had the recession of 1953. It was caused by inflation, very similar to now. And what did the Federal Reserve do? The only thing that they know how to do: increased interest rates, which causes rising unemployment and decreases consumer spending, right? Because the idea of inflation is that there's too much money chasing too few goods. So an obvious way to remedy that whole thing would be to make more goods, right? To decrease the price on all that. But they'd rather take away money from you, right? Because they think you have too much money. Well, I think there's not enough stuff to buy with that money. Alan Greenspan famously said, nothing's stopping us from creating all the money we need. It's rather the productive resources that are the problem. Do we have the economic capacity to create all the value we need to purchase with the money that we create? The usable goods. So when Taurus entered Gemini, 1953, right, consumer spending declined and unemployment surged from 2.7% to 4.5%. That's, nearly twice. And then let's fast forward to 1964, right? In 1964, when Jupiter went into Taurus, it was the same year that, Lyndon Johnson ran for president. It was the same year we got the Civil Rights Act, which was amazing. And economic growth, it rose to 4%, which is pretty good. Inflation was at 1%, but once Jupiter went into Gemini, it just ratcheted up. And then let's fast forward to 1976. This is when Jupiter went into Taurus, right? Just before Jimmy Carter got in the White House. This was the election of 1976. And no, Carter had nothing to do with this. He just came in. But the silly thing is that the presidents who are incoming, they often get blamed for current situations, So, we had a lot of economic improvement. In the 1970s were a big crisis decade, right? For overproduction, for deindustrialization, for privatization. It was the dismantling of the public sphere, or at least the beginning of it, which really sort of accelerated in the 1980s. Excuse me. So inflation, like we said. Now, in 1976, inflation was at 12%, right? And it was cut more than half to 4.6%. So that's economic prosperity, isn't it, with Jupiter and Taurus? So, or rather 1975, inflation was 12%. And for the year 1976, cut to 4.6. That's amazing. 3.8 million more Americans returned to the workforce over the previous year. 3.8 million more Americans were employed. Amazing, right? Labor participation. Well, what happened in 1977 when Jupiter went into Gemini? A recession of 1977. Inflation rose from 5.76% to 6.5%, almost a full percentage point, which is a sharp increase. This was when Jimmy Carter was coming into office, so of course he took a lot of blame and heat for a lot of this stuff. But as we know, incoming presidents don't really affect the economy. It's it's the incumbents who did it. So in 1988, we had a very strong economy once Jupiter went into Taurus. The unemployment rate decreased. The employment rate rose. Well, duh. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes when the unemployment rate decreases, it's because people left the workforce or stopped looking for work. Now, in 1989, when Jupiter went into Gemini, the economy weakened. This was caused by central banking monetary policy, right? Which they were trying to reduce inflation, right? Which instead ended up reducing consumer spending and brought in a recession, the early 1990s recession. Let's fast forward to the last time we had Jupiter in Taurus. Or no, it wasn't the last time. This is 2000. I'm sorry. This was, almost 24 years ago. Jeez Louise. Well, in 2000, it was very prosperous, wasn't it? We had a strong economy. The unemployment rate had dropped to 3.8%, which was the lowest since 1969. Labor participation reached record highs of nearly 65%. But what happened in 2001 once Jupiter went into Gemini? Well, the Federal Reserve had raised interest rates 6 times between 1999 and 2000. And what do we know from history this does? Increase unemployment and brings in a recession, right? Sometimes it actually increases inflation rather than brings it down. This time, inflation went up a full percentage point to 4.5%. I know these numbers don't sound interesting, but this is part of your future and your well-being and ours total, because we could see some difficult times for the year 2024 into 2025 in terms of the economy. And the reason why this is concerning me so much is because economic downturns that precede elections really affect the outcomes of those elections. I'm thinking Weimar Germany, but we won't go there. So what else happened? A recession. Unemployment, we just talked about that, went up by 1.6 percentage points to 5.6%, and 2 million more Americans were put out of work. Unemployment. 2 million. Estimates for rising interest rates this time around, to do what the Federal Reserve wants us to do, could result in 10 million people losing their jobs. That's 5 times as much. Oh my goodness, right? Well, let's fast forward to 2011 to 2012, when Jupiter once again was in Taurus. This was during Barack Obama. We had the Great Recession of 2007, 2008 starting to reside. The Iraq War ended, which was, by some estimates, $1 trillion. The Iraq War could have cost us $1 trillion. That's an unfathomable sum, really. Well, we also had corporate profits and dividends surging. And as a response, right, Occupy Wall Street. Now in 2012 through 2013, when Jupiter went into Gemini, economic equality reached its highest since 1928, which we started this presentation with. Recovery was very slow. Our infrastructure was crumbling. It had been crumbling for years. Inequality had been getting worse for years, but this is when we really noticed it. And when these things were really making it into the mainstream media. Labor participation fell sharply. We were facing a government shutdown. Jeez. And this set the stage for the election of 2016. How? Because people were losing faith in the Democratic Party's ability to help the economy. So, why am I concerned here? I've talked a little bit about this already. Well, right now, what's going on? Unemployment is low, believe it or not. It is very low. It's at 3.4%. Inflation has gone down sharply to 5% from 8%, 3 percentage points, but it's still high. And you're still feeling the hurt. You're still feeling the crunch at the grocery store, probably especially. Make big purchases and you have to use credit or loans, you're really feeling the pain. So now labor force participation has increased since the beginning of this year, 2023. Corporate profits have increased, driven a lot by corporate greed, not just inflation. Inflation's being driven by corporate greed, right? Not even just rising costs. Now we're facing the debt ceiling and a potential debt default, which would spell absolute ruin for a lot of us. Excuse me. The reason being is it would decrease the credit rating of the United States, and it would get way, way, way more expensive for us to borrow money. So there are a lot of potential catastrophes from a debt default. At the very least, right, it would cause a recession, probably worldwide. So now I don't think this will happen, right? Because we've just entered Jupiter in Taurus, which is a relatively prosperous time. So what I do see is that we may kick the can down the road for about a year until Jupiter goes into Gemini. And then I would expect some difficulty. Although there is an event that I did notice, happening here pretty quick in September of this year. Let me see if I can animate just a little bit. A month. September. Let's go forward a couple days to the 19th. Oops, days, not hours. So here's the 19th. You might notice here that Mars, right? And Mars rules what houses for the US? The 12th, yeah, and the 5th. The 5th is gambles, right? And it's also games. The 12th house is self-undoing, right? What's Saturn rule? Saturn rules the 2nd house. Well, and the 3rd, but the 2nd house especially here is relevant because it's money. So you have the ruler of self-undoing on top of the ruler of finance. And then oftentimes I'll see Venus get involved. She'll be poorly dignified usually, but she's not here. Venus rules the 6th house of enemies and injuries and illnesses, right? Economic illness. Now, she's placed in the 9th house there of foreign dealings. So this could have foreign implications, right? Or it could be, exacerbated by a foreign situation or foreign markets. You can think of the war in Ukraine right now. You can think of diplomatic relations, right, with other countries, which, you know, are sort of contentious right now. We're entering a multipolar world. So anyway, the purpose of this little exposition, though, was talking about some of the predictions, financial predictions that could be coming up. So I think we will, my personal feeling is that we will get through the debt ceiling part, but only temporarily. We do have banking crises, sort of looming, a banking crisis. We had First National Bank go under, or sorry, First Republic Bank, I think. And then we also, gosh, I can't remember the two names. I can't remember, I'm so sorry. It's such a rotten thing. It's such a rotten thing. So First Republic Bank and Signature Bank and Silicon Valley Bank, right? So we've had 3 bank failures here in not even a year, not even 6 months. So this is something to keep an eye on because we do see these Mars-Saturn contacts in the United States natal chart when it comes to some economic downturns and banking crises. So what sort of things do I think are going to happen in 2024 and 2025? Right? We talked about banking issues and the debt default possibly being temporarily averted to next year. But I think some crisis is likely in June. Some sort of, sorry, not June, September. Some sort of downturn. Now, I'm thinking summer 2024 could be a bad shock. So this is just something not to scare us or be overly concerned about, but just something to be aware of. And none of these things are definite. I'm just a lowly, astrology nerd. I don't know everything. I've just been, keeping an eye on these couple of things. And I thought it was worth sharing with you. So anyway, please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. Please comment on if you remember or recall any sort of events in your own life surrounding some of these transits. That would be very, very helpful. And I do wonderful readings. You would love them. You can email me. All my information is below in the description. And please, 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 please follow me on other social media platforms. I promise you'll get more fun. So, anyway, this is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl, and you have a wonderful whatever you're having.
Transmission.